Hi everyone, I'm Sydney. I'm an Ignite Studio Assistant. I am here today to show you all about our watercolor kit that you can find in our kit library. This is our watercolor kit. In our kit, you will find all the materials you need to get started on watercolor painting. That includes a towel for cleanup, a roll of masking tape, a book on how to get started if you've never done watercolors before, watercolor paper, which is more absorbent than normal mixed media paper and also has a tooth or a texture that complements watercolor really well. And then also our watercolors. These are dried cakes. They activate with water. And you can see the little mixing wells in the paint palette as well. So that's where you'll mix your colors. Today I will show you how to do some different techniques and how to use some different brushes with the watercolor set. So here is a clipboard that you can find in Ignite's kit library and check out as well. So on the clipboard, I'm just gonna take one of the pieces of watercolor paper. I'm gonna tape it down using the masking tape. So taping your paper down will help keep your paper in place. Watercolor paper is more absorbent, but that's not going to stop it from buckling completely under the weight of the water. So we want to make sure to help keep it flat so your watercolors don't pool up in different ways than you want it to. This will also help create a nice clean border for your piece afterwards. As you can see here, I've got a cup for cool colors and a cup for warm colors. We like to keep those separate so the colors don't mix and make a brown muddy water that influences the color of your paint that you're trying to put down. So the variety of brushes that you'll get in your kit is pretty large. We have some bigger brushes like these. These are good for washes, which is what we call painting big areas in watercolor. So depending on how you hold the brushes will change the kind of stroke that you put down. So if you put big washes of color down with this one, you can do it with this one as well, or you can also use just the point to get a finer line. And then we have some smaller brushes as well that'll change the shape and the texture of the watercolor paint depending on how you put it down. This angled brush is really good for getting in corners and doing detail work. Square brushes, square flat angle brushes like this are really good for putting down large washes of color. And then this is your pretty standard round pointed brush that can do a variety of things. I'll show you some examples. So I'm going to put some water on my brush and then wet my paint cake. And you can do a big nice line like that. Or you can hold the paintbrush a little bit differently and do a really fine thin line. I'll show you the angled brush next. Big flat area or a little line. And then I'll show you the bigger brush that we have as well. As you can see, big area, less suited to detail work, but can certainly get that fine line. I'll also show you today some techniques about watercolor painting that you should know before you get started. The first one is called wet on wet. So we have to wet the paper first. I just wet my paintbrush in my water and put some water down onto the paper, and then I will wet my brush again, wet the paint cake, and then put the pigment down in that area that I had wet on the paper. And that's a wet on wet technique for putting paint down. Another technique that we use in watercolor painting is wet on dry. So we don't wet the paper first. It's wet paint on dry paper. And that creates a more opaque pigmented color, depending on how you want to use your paints. And then to mix two colors on the paper, let's mix red and yellow to make orange. I will wet that area first. I'm going to put some red down on this end. clean my brush off, and then put some yellow down on this end. And then I'm just gonna kind of scrub my brush to bring the two together. And the water will help with that. You can see I ended up with that orange in the middle. I have some examples here that I did earlier to show you how this is all going to dry. So this is our mix that I just showed you how to do. This is how it'll end up looking when it's dried. This is the wet on dry, and this is the wet on wet. So you can see that this is much more light and ethereal. This is much more opaque and pigmented. It just depends on what kind of painting that you're going for. I'll also show you some resist techniques to vary the texture in your painting. You can find in art supply stores some different materials that will preserve the color of your paper to get that pure white, like a cloud or the white of someone's eye. But you can also just use a white crayon. I'll draw some shapes here so you can see. You can just use a white crayon, put that just straight down on your paper, and then we will cover it with our watercolor paint to see the shapes we just made. And then you can just rub off the wax when the paint has dried. Another technique that we have the supplies for here at Ignite is it's also a resist technique. It's using salt to create an interesting texture. So in this area that I did a wet on wet wash, I'm just gonna go ahead and pour some salt right into. And then when the salt fully dries, I will scrub away the salt and I'll be left with this really interesting texture, kind of tie-dye texture. You can kind of see an example of that here. All right, that's all the techniques you need to get started with our watercolor kit. Happy painting, and we hope to see you here in Ignite soon. Bye.